Hi everyone, thanks for coming this evening to Tide Talk number 9 here at the Tide store in Old Street Station in London. This evening is the final of our Tide Talks in this series, although there will be other Tide Talks in the future. My name is George, I'm the founder of Tide. Tide, as you know, is the banking service which exists to save small businesses time and money. And an interesting example of how in our organisation we had to think about saving time and money was in when we realised that we were a new company that nobody had heard of, and it was important to generate some trust in what Tide was doing, that we wanted to have a physical space somewhere central that would communicate what we were all about. But having said all that, we were a new company, and of course we didn't necessarily want to invest or risk a crazy amount of money on kind of rebuilding Harvey Nichols to show off our brand. So it was a tough call. We got very lucky. We were introduced to an incredible architect, Jenny, who is with us this evening, who is the individual who designed and created this space. And because she did what we considered to be an amazing job, we thought she obviously knows a thing or two about this question of how you represent a brand in a physical space. And it was a real voyage of discovery for us to work out how to do this best, and we thought our members might benefit from hearing more about that topic as well. So we invited Jenny to give this talk this evening. So without further ado, Jenny Jones.
Thank you, George, and thank you all for coming this evening. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's great to be in the Tide pop-up space. So, the aim of the talk this evening is hopefully to be helpful and inspiring. And I've aimed the information really for people, online brands that are thinking of venturing into the physical realm. But the principles are not really product or service specific, because essentially the big theme here is about not replicating your virtual existence into your real physical one, but it's about creating a place or a space where people can come together, like we are now. Doing so gives great opportunities to build friendship with your customers, to develop the cultural dimension and depth of your brand, and to create momentum. And as a designer, I know that the effect the environment has on the way that you feel and behave. And if you harness that potential, then it's a brilliant tool to have in your palette. It's not an add-on, it actually is critical to how your customers will perceive your brand. So I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes. I'm going to do a little bit of background of me, and then I'm going to do a little bit of project management 101, and then I'm going to talk about some secret sauces. So, okay, here we go. So, I'm an architect. I've been practicing for about 20 years. Can't believe that. And I'm still practicing. And sometimes I like to say that I'm kind of like, I feel like I'm a doctor of space and form. And I think the first time that George and I spoke, I felt like I was doing some kind of like diagnosis. I'm listening to what you want to do, what you want to achieve, and it feels like, okay, yeah. And then we take that on board, and it's sort of like a prognosis by design. Space and form, these are our tools. And then we take it on and we deliver that into reality, a bit like the operation. And then actually, after that delivery, once it's been made, it's really great to go back and see how things are working, because in the end, that's what it's about. It's about the human experience, how we occupy those spaces and how that works. So it's been really great to continue this dialogue. I've, as much as architecture is about, or design is about gravity, things not falling down, about the legals and about commerciality, it's also about scenography and about how the place in the space scripts the human experience. I've worked on projects for loads of brands, and I've worked through interpreting their values and ambitions into a three-dimensional experience. And I've worked on airports and towers and shops, new buildings, adaptive reuses of existing. It's always a synthesis, regardless of the size, the scale, whether it's inside or outside. That's my practice. So project management 101. I guess like for some folk this is going to be super simple. Everyone knows it, but and it'll be a refresher. But I think what I really wanted to say that it doesn't matter the size of the project, there is a process. A tiny project to a master plan, there's always a roadmap. I suppose in a way, like when you're starting out, when you're getting to know this, you look up and you see the people that have been doing it for years, and it reminds me a little bit of when you're learning to drive, and you can't understand how the clutch works, and then you can, and you're like, how could that ever have been a problem? So it becomes automatic. And I think in the world of NLP, they call that unconscious competence. So somehow it feels like when you're working with a team and people understand what the process is, then there's this kind of this way that you can challenge that, and you can create, and you can work off that, you can be curious, you can mess around with it. But it's really important to respect that process, because that somehow, that iteration through those different sequences, which we'll go through, is vital. Even more so when you're doing something in a physical space. Because if you're used to the digital, you can compress Apple Z or Control Z, and it's gone. But you can't do that. Once on the process of building, it becomes, well, you can, but it's a very expensive and time-consuming thing. So it's very important to kind of respect the process. This is the Royal Institute of British Architecture process, which again really does work in some form or another for whatever scale of project you're doing. And actually what we did here is a version of that. So you start with the idea, you develop the design, you build it, and you use it. So there are always possibilities for shortcuts, for overlaps and so on, but there are always going to be consequences of doing that, which generally tend to be on cost and quality. I suppose that the cost, time and quality triangle, the tension between those things exists in most industries, but it certainly exists in design and build industry. As not my grandmother, as my boyfriend's grandmother used to say, and he tells me all the time, you can't have a penny and a bun. So, and then another little story, a pop-up can be for Christmas. It can, but it probably needs to be planned from several months before. So you have to set up a timeline. So that tension triangle between cost, time, and quality. To sort of get in preparation for that roadmap, you might say, okay, how long does it take before we can open? And as an example of that, this place took 3 months from initial discussions that you guys had to us being involved, and Christmas was in the middle of all of that. So that's super fast, and you can do that. Or, you know, if you know you're going to be, if you're not necessarily doing something that's a pop-up, if it's something that's going to be around for longer, then obviously it's going to take longer, and your budget might have to grow. But really, the answer to how long it'll take is that it does take time to get it right. And I believe that you need a minimum of a month to come back with a concept that is tuned to a brief. If you have less time, it's likely that we won't get the sort of dimension and the specificity and the depth. So if you're okay with a shallow concept, then cut the time. That's all. Budget. There is a lot of costs involved. The first thing that you really have to consider is that you're going to need someone in your team on this project. It's an investment. They can't do it at the same time as doing their regular work. It's just not going to happen. It takes a lot of concentration, organization. You're going to have to hire a space, probably. You might have to pay for fees, legals and so on, and you are going to have to pay for fees for skills that you don't have in-house. Project management, maybe. Architects, designers, photographers. If the more complex the project, the scale grows up, then you might have structural engineers, cost consultants. You know, it can be a really big team. So that's also quite super important to plan this out, because as the roadmap goes further down the line, the more people are involved. You're going to have to pay for fabrication, production, construction. You can be smart about that. It could be that, for instance, with pop-ups, you can have an attitude to how things are going to be used afterwards. You can reuse things and so on. So that, again, can come into your sort of cultural idea of how you're going to pop up. And then once you have popped up, then you have operation costs. You have staff, you have the training of that staff, which takes time. You have hospitality, you have events, programming, takeaways, insurance. So even if you have that startup mindset, which is so brilliant, the idea of the MVP, you've got to remember that your customer is going to be immersed in what you create. It's not just a screen interface. They're going to be in it. And we're very sophisticated, and we'll feel, and we'll see, and we'll read, unconsciously or consciously, that you've taken shortcuts. And if that is one of your brand values, then great. But if it isn't, you really don't want people to feel that. So it's super important that you invest the right time and cost involved. So the secret sauce. It's not that secret, but maybe it's good to call it out a secret. And the secret sauce, I think, first one, anyway, the first ingredient, is you, is the person that makes the brand. The person that's behind the company, the person that's driven that, the team. And if you can access and spend time figuring out what your DNA is, then that is the thing that will make it an authentic experience. The most successful projects that I've worked on have started from a super considered brief from the client. We can help clients draw out the brief. That's great, but it still has to come from a position of value, purpose, ambition. So when you think about values and purpose, this, if you think about it in another way, is the script for the type and quality of interactions that you're going to create for your customers and for your team. These are Tide's values, which are brilliant. And it was so great to work with Tide and to have their manifesto as a call to action, which is on the wall there. To spend time on things that matter, so that we can go and we can start fires, and we can choose how we spend our time, like coming to Tide's pop-up and listening to this tonight, for example. But seriously, the programming of the customer journey follows from the values and purpose and behaviours. So for instance, here it was about the daytime being about demos, about the product, and in the evening about hosting events and creating community and spreading inspiration and education. And as a design team, what we also saw from the brief from Tide was that we saw Tide as an example of a Venn, of an overlap, and that overlap allowed us all to save time and money. Thank you to George. And the design of the space is flowed from these values and behaviours. So we created an environment where the Tide team and founder members can stand side to side and face to face, which, as the app is doing, is challenging the old ways. Anachronism prevails where there are barriers and counters and screens between us and them, which is an old version of trust. That's not relevant anymore, and that's what the app is. So, and in a sense, the metaphor of the app carries through into the way that the space performs and the way that you interact with your customers. Other thing to really consider from this special sauce, number one ingredient, is the ambition of what you're doing and what outcomes you might imagine happening. This might mean that you have to journey in time and imagine what might shift in your company as a result of creating this one-to-one experience. What would your community say about the experience they've had having gone to your store? Walk in their shoes for a bit, empathise with their desires, if you like. Because ultimately, of course, the aim of going into this venture, which is costly in the end, is to get more business. And you guys are the business innovators. You're the ones who are challenging the assumptions, you're disrupting, you're creating new products and services. So when you take on this venture, do the same. And you can challenge us as designers, as doctors of space and form, to work with you, to create spaces that are memorable and create new experiences for people. Or if that all seems like an awful lot to think about, you could just say, ask a question. The first retail project that I worked on, I was on the team at OMA, which is Rem Koolhaas's architecture office, when Prada came to us and said, what would the concept be for a flagship store for our brand in 2000? So obviously it's quite a while ago. It wasn't like they were doing something retrospectively. The thing is, it's still relevant. That's why I bring it up. We said, well, look, you know, it's not about just using a larger footprint and putting more dresses out and selling more. We suggested that they took on, like, so all of these green squares represent Prada stores, and they had this identikit environment design. And we said, okay, take some epicenters, and in those epicenters, allow the design of the space to be generated by the context it's in, by the cultural context, by the geographical context, and create a mix of shopping and events and technology. And this store in New York is still seen as a sort of benchmark for how to create an aura for a brand. So in the end, there was a much larger effect on the brand awareness of the company than if they just put out more dresses. So the programming of the space aligned to challenging the initial question. Secret sauce, ingredient number 2, is the senses. So that's what we kind of work with in a way when we talk about space and form. Really what it is we're talking about is how we respond, how we sense what we're in, and how we respond to that environment. So at this point I don't want to show a whole series of images and say you could do this, you could do that. It's not about that. The point is that we have all these senses that we can work with, and we use them in a different kind of, like a massive sort of sound engineering board. You mix them up, and that becomes the print for something that's bespoke to your brief, to your site, to your budget, to your values. So there's never a facsimile. You don't get a gimmick. You get something that's authentic to the question. As tools, these are the tools that we use as designers, in the sense we're synthesizing the brief with senses to create a blueprint. So we look at dimension, because that's how we feel space. We have ergonomics. We know what we're doing, the way that we move around, and how we can feel compressed, uncomfortable, or we can feel like that changes the way we feel with something, how we interact with others. We take on board the real and the virtual, because nowadays you're not just somewhere, you're how you're seen to be somewhere. And so that reach is really interesting, because of course you can create something that might be an Instagrammable moment, we hope. We think about how space exists in time, because really you can only experience space and time. So the pace of the way that you move through somewhere, we can play with that. That's a kind of choreography. We also know that the way that the space is arranged is identifiable to us, and we have cultural readings of spaces, but essentially also just the way that we sit informs the way that we're behaving. So then there's the way that things connect up, the adjacency, so from one moment to the next, which in a sense goes back to choreography, but also how you approach a space, so the things that are beyond our control, but we consider them. How do you get in here? What are the sight lines? You know, these are all the things that we're processing through. We also know stuff about neuroscience and readings. For example, when we see an object, there's a message that travels through the motor cortex, and an electrical impulse is released that is actually mimicking the action of the object you're seeing. So if you see a hammer, you have this boom happening. That's what goes through your mind. And what can also happen is if you see a scene, it goes down a different pathway, which actually releases opiates. So you can play with these facts, these bits of science, and sometimes we know about these things intuitively, but then we can have them backed up with science, which is great. We read texture and we make associations with those emotively. So we can see it without even touching it. We have an emotional connection with what the texture is going to feel like, and that we can play with that too. And we can use scent to create narratives, which is super powerful, and maybe getting used more now, but I think there's a whole lot more that can be done with that. Sound. So that's the production or the curation of what you hear, but it's also the quality of the acoustic in the space and how you can manipulate that, which can be really intense experience. Or like we know that that sound of the cathedral. I mean, that makes you quiet. So it affects the way that you behave. The materials themselves, as well as having technical properties, they have cultural backstories and associations. So we say, wow, that's luxurious, or we say, oh, that's cheap. Or we think, oh, that's so from this region, that's so local. Or we think, you react to these things, they bring stories to it. And then on the right, this is all the same material, but it's just how it, with a little bit of additive of some chemical or another, it just changes, and over time it changes. So maybe you won't see that in the life of a pop-up, but it's just these these things that we can start to play with. Opacity is really interesting, because if you play with how much you can see through something, so from 100% when you can't see through and it's opaque, to being transparent, and in between that, the translucency, those things are really like metaphors. So they work really well with brands as a way of translating, how you want to come across. Objects and surfaces, the arrangement of them, the scale, their sensory qualities. We can play with light, how bright it is, how dark it is, the color temperature, because there's registers of color temperatures which are like daylight, and then there's something like candlelight, so you can manipulate that. You can play with it. You can change the scenes. You can have lighting that you have to work with that's existing, and it has a sort of weird effect on your skin, or you can have the most beautiful like color rendering indexes and so on. So it's massive, right? Color, so you can use brand colors like we did here, so that there's a connection back to the sort of digital world, and they communicate with each other. Or you can play with the perception of color from the knowledge about the neural responses we have to different ends of the spectrum. So it's quite a lot that we have whirring away through that process of like 2 days, no, I'm joking, when a month, when you come up with a concept. And what we do then is like, we're kind of like, oh, is it that? Is it that? Oh, no, I don't know. And you get you're working through something, you're testing it out, you're drawing. When we draw, we're thinking, really. That's what's going on with types like us. And then eventually, of course, it gets to the point where it's a blueprint. And off it goes to the guys, and they make it. But the point is that actually, through that process, what you're doing is you're feathering out, you're testing, and you're taking things down to a point where, yeah, this is what we're going to work with. So you're finding the essence of what space and form, materials, etc., light, work for that brand. So that is it, guys. That's my sort of download.
Jenny, thank you so much. Amazing talk. I imagine members of our audience have some questions, so if you do have a question, please put your hand up. Yes.
Thank you for your talk, Jenny. It was really interesting. It's just a very simple technical question, and I've actually always wondered when I've been to see exhibitions, is the text on the wall, is that transfers and that's sprayed on, and how's that done, for example?
It's a process that's called rub down. It's like decal, rub down. So it's a little bit like, you remember those tattoos you used to get, like it's a bit like that. So it's on the paper, and then you kind of rub it down, and then you pull the paper off.
Okay, all of it. Yeah.
All of it, yeah. I'm looking to Nick, because Nick and I worked on this together, and
plastic vinyl.
Oh, plastic vinyl.
Both print companies will produce it for you.
Yeah, decal. Funny old name.
But it's also called rub down.
Well, you rub. That's the action.
Yeah.
That's what you see. They kind of like do lots of rubbing, and then they peel away really slowly. It's like Letraset used to be.
Oh, okay, yes.
Yeah.
Another question.
Thank you. Thank you, Jenny. Regardless of size of the jobs that you have, obviously you saw Prada there, which is slightly larger.
Yeah, slightly larger, yeah.
Do you sort of go through your special sources and look at those for everything?
Totally. And I think maybe Prada was an unusual job. I'm not even sure now in this climate whether it would be run the same way, but that was a 6-month concept period. So we asked the question several times, went round and round, and tested out so many different ways of doing things. So But it is similar. That's the thing. It's kind of the same process all the time. You exhaust the possibilities, and then you get to what feels like the right essence. And that's a weird thing, actually. It's when you actually think, oh, that's the right thing. That feels right. It's not really definable. It just kind of happens. Mostly.
Great. Thank you. Any further questions?
Yeah, really great talk. I was just wondering, so once you receive a brief, what are the kind of like key questions that you immediately go to kind of define so that you have an understanding of what that brand stands for, and then like, so you say we've got like the brand purpose out here, that's a really great thing for you to go off. So are there any other things that you always ask and like look for?
I think the ambition is really, really key, because then if you listen really carefully, you might hear something even more challenging in it, because in a way, it's such a special thing to do, right? Is to make a project. For everyone that's involved, it's great to do something that you really all feel like you're challenging yourselves. So I suppose I'd listen again and again to what the ambition is for the space.
Oh, somebody nearer. There we go. Right, sorry.
Jenny, I was interested when you showed the process about the end bit. So once it exists, how do you kind of refine and play with what people are experiencing once it's kind of live, as it were? What's your experience right here of that? Maybe you can answer that as well, George. What has the real experience of customers been reflected in what you hoped? Or has that been different?
So, yes, is the short answer. It has been. We have witnessed. Actually, I'm on the microphone, so I've got trouble with this one. So, the answer to the question is yes. We have seen almost exactly the sorts of behaviours in here that we hoped for, which were that during the day, people wander in and they feel like they're just sort of playing around, experimenting around. There's a lot of a sense of wandering in the store in a very positive way. Like, you go to an area and you find out a thing, and if you want to, you can talk to one of our team and they'll talk to you. You can also play with the screens, and you can also look at the idea wall. In fact, we have the community wall where we take pictures of our members, and you could look at this and understand a bit about what Tide is for. And in the evening, as you can see this evening, the space has worked really, really well for these talks. So, in terms of what has surprised us about the space, I think maybe the versatility of it. To this week, and we only decided to do this last week, but this week in the mornings we've been dishing out coffees to people walking past. So if you come to Old Street tomorrow morning or the next couple of days, you can get coffee from one of 5 different coffee brands, and we're dishing them out in the rush hour.
Free?
For free.
Oh, that's on the internet now.
So it's definitely worth your £30 commute to get Wall Street for that. And that's just it's worked because the space is open and it can accommodate something like that. That's been valuable for us because it helps us to, in that example, A, showcase a small business, which is the coffee brand, but also B, give people a reason to come into our store about Tide. Similarly, we held a networking event here where all of these rows were held back, and you would just kind of wander in and have a bit of a natter and have the music on loud, and that worked out fine as well. So we've discovered that the openness of the space gives us great versatility. But you didn't come here to listen to me, so anyway.
What happens with double mic?
Oh, you got it, sorry.
Thank you. I was all, of course, designed that way, to be that way. No, we did discuss a lot about openness, didn't we? And I was sort of saying, well, it's okay to have openness because there's enough points of where your eye will go. There's enough sort of attraction points that people will move around the space. And then one thing that we hadn't anticipated, which has worked really well, was the way that the benches move to sit between the leaning what we call the canvases, because then that worked like little booths so that the team could talk to like 3 people, and that was really, watching that work was really fantastic. So I think the thing was, the brief was always about something that could be transformable, and that's worked, you know. You can see, and it's great to see it working. Even that damn column.
Right, yes. It's not a thing of beauty. Do we have time for, I think, one final question?
Well, I was just going to say, knowing that this will be coming to an end soon, and there's a question of recycling as well, because it's the things we didn't touch upon, but everything has to be recycled or used. So would it be an opportunity for you to at some point broadcast the fact that you have things like this, you might want to move on to something
for the community?
For the community.
Very good idea. So indeed, it is true that the benches you're sitting on need a new home. So if anyone wants them, right at the back, my colleague Valentine has got a hand up just there. She is the person to talk to about the benches. I think we're probably done. But Jenny, thank you so much for enjoying.